What's up? Well, I've watched a lot of American videos and I feel that's what I should be saying. The Americans say that, I'm English, I'm going to say good evening, not what's up. Anyway, tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to use your DSLR camera off auto. Lots of people ask me how to do this. They bought great devices and they want to use them to the best of their ability. Please stay watching. How to get off auto? Well, that's the question a lot of people ask. So you bought your DSLR camera, you take the lens cap off, you turn it on, you press the shooter button, it's a little bit dark in here, the flash pops up and you take a photo. Well, you get a great shot, don't you? The flash has popped up, the camera adjusts itself, sorts its settings out, and it's okay, it's not half bad. But really, supposing you want some control over that image, maybe you want to affect the depth of field or the bokeh, maybe you want to take pictures of fast moving objects and freeze them in the frame. Well, taking the camera off auto and set it into either aperture priority, speed priority, or even full manual gives you the ability to do that. For today, I'm going to use my Nikon D5600, but these are principles of photography, and in fact most of these principles will work on the latest mobile phones. Many of the later iPhones, Android devices all have sort of a pro mode, a mode where you can affect maybe the shutter speed or the aperture or various other things to get different effects on the camera. Some people ask me, why bother even investing in a DSLR? After all, they're big, they're fairly bulky compared to your phone, they don't necessarily fit in your pocket as well unless you've got very large pockets. But one of the key reasons is your ability to change the settings on these devices just to get exactly the sort of picture you want. One of the other big reasons is the size of the sensor. On a mobile phone, the sensor is a weenie, probably even smaller than I'm showing you there. But on a camera like this, which is not a full frame, it's a crop mode sensor, the sensor is probably about that tall, many times bigger than a phone. And on a full frame camera, it's probably about that big. The difference is the amount of light that comes through the lens and hits that sensor. So when you don't zoom in to your pictures on your phones, they're beautiful pictures. The AI in the cameras sorts them out, does a lot of the light, and it makes them look beautiful. But you try zooming in, cropping into those, and you'll soon get to the point where you lose all of the detail in the photos. So this is a 22-ish megapixel camera. It's about mid-range these days. Some of the very expensive ones are now going up to 40, 60 and 90, the professional cameras. But even at 22 megapixels, the amount you can crop those images and still get a lot of detail in there is really quite incredible compared to that of mobile phones. So what are some of the basic principles of a camera? And indeed, again, this applies to phones. Well, to state the obvious, the light comes in through the lens. It goes through the lens, past an aperture, and the lens focuses the light. The aperture, which is a diaphragm that opens and closes, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that. It goes past that through the lens, and then it gets to the camera. And in the camera body, there is a shutter. It goes up and down. It's a curtain effect, but in effect, it opens and closes, a bit like curtains. And then beyond that, in the olden days, there used to be film. In these days, there's an electronic sensor, the sensor that actually captures the light. So the light comes in through the lens, through the aperture, the lens focuses the light onto the sensor, and to hit the sensor, you press the button, it flips open the curtain or the shutter, and that lets the light onto the sensor. In essence, that is all there is to it. And in the very beginning days of photography, there would be a glass plate at the back of a pinhole which had no lens, and the aperture would someone be taking the cover off the front of the lens for typically several minutes to let the light onto the glass plate where the chemicals were. But in the days of film, that process improved dramatically, and a digital camera is just the next generation of that thing. This particular camera also has a mirror. It's a single lens reflex mirror, and in here there's a mirror that is like that most of the time, and it focuses the light coming through the lens up here through the prism and out the back through the viewfinder. So I'm seeing what comes in through the lens. When I press the shutter, the mirror flips up, lets the light straight through onto the sensor that is deep inside the camera. It's actually here behind that in the body there. So that's how they work. It's really conceptually very, very simple, but people get quite hung up about the complexities of all of that. Let's look at the lens first of all, and let's look at the aperture. So the light comes in through the lens, and some days it's very, very bright, some days it's not so bright, or maybe you're shooting at night. And depending on how bright it is, depends on how you need to set up the camera, because there's only a certain light setting that really works very, very well on either film or the digital sensors in these cameras. And really there's three mechanisms you can control to fix the amount of light that hits that sensor. The first is the aperture. So the light comes in through the lens and it hits this device, which is like a diaphragm. And the aperture setting opens and closes. Clearly, if it's closed like that, it lets much less light in than it's open like that. So very simply, on a bright day, you'd have it closed more than you'd have it open typically. There are exceptions to what I'm saying. These are measured in F numbers. So when it's wide open like that, it will be a low F number. And the more it closes, the higher the F number will be. And interestingly, if you take one of my lenses here, this happens to be a kit lens. And this particular kit lens ranges for an 18 to 55, but you'll notice these numbers here, 3.5 to 5.6. So they are the most open or the lowest f-stop you can get this particular lens to. So when we're zoomed right out at 18, this will be 3.5, and as I zoom into 55 it will be 5.6, and so it actually changes, the maximum aperture changes depending on how much you've got it zoomed. Now the lens I've got on this camera, so this is an 18 to 55 zoom lens, it's a kit lens, very, it's okay, it's a nice little lens, not ultra sharp because it's a kit lens, relatively cheap comparable to professional lenses, but it's a good little all-rounder. On here is a bit more of an expensive lens, not too expensive, so this one's list price, £160 I think, and it's a 35mm lens, but it's 1.8. Now there's no zoom on this, but this is 1.8, which means that the aperture will open much wider. Now what that means in effect is you can use this lens in darker conditions, so it works much better in darker conditions, it will low light situations, it will work in bright situations as well. So there we have the aperture. It opens and closes and it restricts the amount of light coming in. The next thing that affects the light hitting the sensor at the back of the camera is the shutter speed. So for instance, you've got this shutter. If the shutter goes up and it's open for a long period of time, seconds, it lets a lot more light in than if it goes like that. So typically for maybe indoor events, you might be shooting at 1/60th of a second, maybe 100th. In really bright sunny day conditions, you might be up to many hundredths of a second or maybe even thousandths of a second. Particularly, you might want the thousandths or the very high shutter speed if you're trying to move fast moving objects like maybe birds in flight or maybe motorcycles or cars. The last thing that fixes the light and affects how you set up the camera is how sensitive you make the sensor at the back of the camera. Now in the olden days you'd buy film and the film would be ISO 100, ISO 400, ISO 800. And what this meant was how sensitive the chemicals were on the film to the light hitting. So if you bought ISO 100 film, it would be much less sensitive than ISO 800. So typically you'd buy ISO 100 film maybe for working outside, daylight, summer conditions, and maybe if you're doing an indoor shoot you might use ISO 800. The point being is that with ISO 100 you need less light hitting the sensor than you do with ISO 800. Now today you don't have to worry about keep changing your film in the camera, and really in days gone by it was very difficult to do midway through a roll of film. You couldn't really do it. So today you've got a setting where you can change the ISO, and so if I turn this camera on we can see all three of my settings here on the camera on the back the way I've got it set up. So I've got ISO there, it's currently set at 100. I've got an aperture there set at f8, and I've got this particular, I think it's half a second, or well, it keeps changing, but you know, several tenths of a second where it's actually set up to take the picture. And the point about that is how you change those three together, influencing how much light the camera is metering. And there's only really one setting that really gets that perfect light for any particular shot, and it's a combination of all three. And what this is called is the exposure triangle. So as you change the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, depending on whether you change them up or down, it affects the amount of light coming in the camera. So if you move one for any given situation, if you let more light in the camera, maybe with aperture, you've got to do something maybe with the ISO or the shutter speed to balance out that correction to get an equivalent light reading setting. Now I ask yourself, why bother doing all that? Why not just have one setting for any particular condition? Well, there's all sorts of creative effects you can do by changing the aperture. So for instance, if you have a wide open aperture, a low number, it's great to get those lovely bokeh effects, you know, where your subject's sharp in focus and the background is nicely blurred. You might want to use the shutter speed to get yourself into a position of either having blur in a photograph. So maybe if you're at a fair and you watch the horses go round, you might want to blur on that to give you that sense of motion. Or you might want a high shutter speed to actually freeze it dead still in the frame. The thing about the sensor at the back, you can create other effects in terms of graininess on the photo. By the way, I didn't mention, the larger the ISO number, it means it's more sensitive to light, but also you get more of a grainy effect, little dots all over the picture. It's not as clear, not as sharp. And in the film days, that used to have sort of a creative distinction to those sorts of photographs. So by changing all of those three settings, you can get different results. So there we are, auto on the camera. And as I showed you earlier on, you switch the camera on, you press the half press the shutter, flash pops up, and you take a photo. Well, that's fine, it works. So the first thing to get off auto is you don't always want the flash popping up, do you? So you might notice on this camera and many other cameras, there is a sort of a flash symbol and it's crossed out. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn the camera to that. Now what that means is still an auto, but the flash won't go off. Now what's going to happen is because the flash won't go off, it may or may mean the photo is too dark, but it will give you a different effect. If I show you on this one, this first photo is one that I took with the flash on. It's a bit washed out, a bit bright. If I look at that one, as it happens, without the flash, with this particular lens and setup, in my view, this is a much more pleasing photograph. So that's the first thing you can do. Very simply, you can turn the flash off, turn the flash on. You're sort of out of auto mode now. The next thing I think you want to do, I think the most useful next thing is to put it on aperture priority. So this is a Nikon. I'm going to turn it round to the A. There are very similar settings on Canon, on Fuji, on Sony. They all pretty much follow the same principles. But on Nikon, A is for aperture priority, not auto, aperture priority. Now what this means is that I am now in control of the aperture. And for any given ISO setting, that's the sensitivity of the sensor, if I change the aperture, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed to get a perfectly exposed shot. So if we look at this behind the camera, if I turn up the aperture, the shutter speed will change. So in effect, the bigger the aperture number, that's the smaller the diaphragm, means there's less light. What the camera will do was increase the shutter speed. Now clearly, what I've got here, I'm now on f20 and I've actually got a 6-second shutter. So for most circumstances, unless you're on a tripod and things are very, very still, that's not really going to work. Move the aperture right down until I got a shutter speed that was one that I could hold still. Now this happens to be a stabilized lens. It's inbuilt stabilization, which means I know from practice I can get down to about a 20th of a second. I've got no wobble in my hands, I can get down to that. So I can get an aperture nice and wide to let in lots of light, and I can change these settings. I can also change it by, on this particular camera, I've got a particular button I can press which modifies that wheel there, and instead of changing the aperture, it changes the ISO. And I also know on this camera I can get an ISO up to about 1200, and it goes as low as 100, about 1200, and really there isn't that much grain. It's very livable with. Above about maybe 2000 it starts to get a bit grainy. But your camera will be different, and the only real way of finding out is just to do some experimenting. So having had a look at aperture, let's have a look at a shutter. Now, again, on a Nikon camera, it's very easy. We turn the dial around for S for shutter, and now it's shutter priority. Very similar to the way aperture priority works is what shutter priority does is it now lets you control the shutter, the camera will adjust the aperture, and the ISO is fixed. So the ISO is set as you set it, it doesn't change it. But as you change the shutter speed on the camera will adjust the aperture so that you get the right metering to get the right contrast shot. So for instance, if you're in a situation where maybe you needed to have the shutter open and close at a certain speed for a particular reason, maybe you want to take pictures of birds, fast-moving objects, children running around even. Maybe you want a higher shutter speed. That is your priority, not necessarily whether you get the bokeh or those creative effects. You'd set it on shutter priority. And again, just like aperture, what I suggest you do is put it on shutter and have a play. Just try it with different effects and see what happens. And while you're trying out aperture priority and shutter priority, just change the ISO setting as well on your camera. So ISO 100 is probably the lowest number your camera goes to, and that means that the sensor is least sensitive. As you move up through the ISO numbers, it becomes more sensitive. So what you should do is just try looking at your camera settings here at the back. You can see how they are, and if you change your ISO, you will know that notice that the camera actually changes either the shutter or the aperture, depending on which setting you've got it on, to actually keep the camera right exposed. So once you've tried shutter priority and aperture priority, the next thing to try is put it on manual mode, which is M on this camera, and now the camera lets all three of these things, the aperture, the shutter and the ISO, act in isolation. So it's now up to you to change each of those individually. And I'm going to leave that as a subject of another video to explain how you calculate and work out in your mind how changing one of those, like the ISO or the shutter or the aperture, might affect the others so that you can get the right exposed. So I hope you've really enjoyed this video. I'd really love to answer your questions, or if you've got any ideas for other things you would like me to explain about how a camera works, or maybe some creative effects that you can do, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them for you. Bear in mind, I'm not a professional photographer and these are my points of view. Anyway, if you found this useful, please subscribe, please like the video. It really helps me grow my user base and gives me incentives to provide even more content for you. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great evening. See you. Bye.